Imagine building a luxury hotel only to be treated as an outsider within its own walls. When Sarah, the proud owner of the Crystal Palm, walks in as an anonymous guest, she's ignored, judged, and ultimately cast out by her own staff. But this dismissal is only the beginning, as Sarah uncovers a deeper web of secrets and betrayal lurking behind the glamorous facade. The lobby of the Crystal Palm Hotel sparkled under grand chandeliers, casting warm glows across polished marble floors. Ornate flowers adorned the halls, and staff bustled about in pristine uniforms, welcoming guests with smiles and handshakes. To an outsider, it was flawless, a luxury sanctuary in the heart of the city. But for Sarah, this wasn't just any hotel. It was her creation. For nearly 3 years, Sarah had poured her heart and soul into building the Crystal Palm, a haven where travelers from all walks of life could experience a taste of refined luxury. She had worked tirelessly, balancing style with inclusivity, hoping it would set an example in an industry not always known for its openness. But a nagging feeling had taken root in her heart, an instinct she couldn't ignore. Was her hotel truly living up to her ideals? Dressed in a simple pair of jeans, a plain white blouse, and sneakers, Sarah walked through the revolving doors as if she were any other guest. Her normally polished look was toned down, and her only accessory was an old leather bag slung over her shoulder. There would be no chauffeur, no assistant trailing behind her with a clipboard, and certainly no entourage. Today, Sarah wanted to see the Crystal Palm through the eyes of an everyday guest. She wanted to know how the staff treated someone who didn't fit the stereotypical image of a luxury hotel client. As she approached the front desk, Sarah noticed a young man in a sleek, neatly pressed suit, typing away on a computer. He exuded an air of confidence, and his posture suggested he had perfected the routine of welcoming elite guests. But when he looked up and saw her, his gaze turned colder, sharper. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his tone polite but distant. "But this hotel has a certain standard for its guests." Sarah's brow furrowed. "A standard?" The man's expression didn't soften. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a different establishment down the street. They offer a more affordable experience." Sarah blinked, stunned. She had expected indifference or perhaps some hesitation due to her casual attire, but this was outright dismissal. "People like you." His words echoed in her mind, filled with an implication that struck her deeply. Taking a deep breath, she suppressed the urge to reveal her identity. Instead, she managed a polite smile. "I've heard this hotel is one of the best. I'm willing to pay." The receptionist didn't budge. "As I said, ma'am, we have a standard," he replied curtly, gesturing toward the exit. He didn't even bother to check for available rooms. Sarah's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She could reveal who she was, pull rank, and have this man scrambling with apologies. But the deeper part of her knew that her response had to be more measured. She couldn't just address this moment. She needed to understand how far this behavior extended in her own hotel. "All right then," she replied coolly, stepping back from the desk. She turned and took a few slow steps away, her heart pounding with each one. She glanced back, noticing a well-dressed couple entering the lobby. They were immediately greeted with beaming smiles and courtesy that had been denied to her. It was clear, this wasn't about availability, it was about image. As she moved toward the door, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a message from Rachel, her assistant. "Everything running smoothly at the hotel?" A bitter smile crept across Sarah's face as she quickly typed back, "I wish. We have a problem." Despite the simmering anger rising within her, Sarah wasn't quite ready to involve Rachel. First, she needed to get to the bottom of this problem on her own. Without leaving the hotel, she decided to investigate further by visiting the hotel's restaurant. The dining area was a place she had personally designed to welcome guests of all backgrounds. She wanted it to exude warmth and elegance in equal measure, with tables set apart just enough to offer intimacy, yet close enough to foster a shared experience of luxury. Sarah approached the hostess stand, where a young woman in a polished uniform greeted her with a curt, polite smile. "Hello, may I have a table?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady. The hostess glanced at her, her eyes moving from Sarah's simple blouse to her worn sneakers. The frown that followed was barely perceptible, but Sarah didn't miss it. "Do you have a reservation?" the hostess asked. "No, I was hoping to walk in," Sarah replied. She peeked past the hostess and saw at least 5 empty tables. It was early in the evening, and the dining area was far from full. "We're fully booked," the hostess said flatly, crossing her arms. Her gaze was unwavering, uninviting. Sarah felt a familiar warmth of frustration rise in her chest. "I see there are some tables available," she replied, gesturing toward the vacant spots. "Are you sure there's no way I can be accommodated?" The hostess didn't even look in the direction of the empty tables. "They're reserved," she replied firmly, a small edge to her tone. Sarah held her ground, her voice dropping to a soft, assertive tone. "Are you refusing to seat me because of the way I look?" The hostess hesitated, just for a moment, before her expression turned dismissive. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have policies here." Policies. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the issue went deeper than she had feared. She nodded, her calm demeanor masking the whirlwind of emotions within her. She wasn't just disappointed. She was shaken. How many other guests had been treated like this without her knowing? As she turned to leave the restaurant, her mind raced with thoughts of what she should do next. She needed to find out whether this behavior was isolated or systemic, and she was determined not to let her staff know who she really was, at least not yet. However, just as she was nearing the lobby exit, the young man from the front desk appeared again, this time with 2 uniformed security guards at his side. They walked purposefully toward her, their expressions serious. "Ma'am," the receptionist said firmly, "we're going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Sarah's jaw dropped. "Excuse me?" "This is private property," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the guests in the lobby. "We have the right to refuse service to anyone." As the security guard stepped forward, a wave of humiliation and disbelief washed over Sarah. They were treating her like an intruder in her own hotel. She knew she could reveal her identity in that moment and stop all of this, but a deeper instinct held her back. Instead, Sarah smiled and said, "All right, I'll leave." As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Sarah's mind was already working. This was no ordinary problem, and it wasn't going to be solved by a simple reprimand. This was her hotel, her dream, and it was clear now that something had gone terribly wrong within its walls. With renewed determination, Sarah walked down the street, her mind racing with a plan. She wasn't just going to fix this. She was going to uncover the truth, no matter how deep it went. As Sarah walked away from the Crystal Palm Hotel, she felt a pang of shock and anger unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Her own hotel had turned her away, dismissing her as though she didn't belong. It was a stunning revelation, but her resolve only strengthened with each step she took. This was more than a mere inconvenience. It was an indication of something fundamentally broken within her beloved establishment. She took a seat on a park bench nearby, glancing back at the hotel from across the street. She couldn't shake the feeling that the exclusionary behavior she'd just experienced wasn't limited to her alone. If they had been so quick to judge her, how many other guests had been treated the same way? How many people had faced subtle or overt dismissal because they didn't fit the part? Taking a deep breath, Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed the number of her assistant, Rachel. The phone rang only once before her cheerful voice answered. "Hey Sarah, how's everything going at the hotel?" Sarah paused, gathering her thoughts before responding. "Rachel, I need your help. I think we have a problem, a serious one." Rachel's tone shifted instantly, her cheerfulness replaced by concern. "What happened?" Sarah briefly recounted the events of the evening, explaining how she had been turned away at the front desk and the restaurant, ultimately escorted out by security. Rachel was silent for a moment, clearly processing the information. "Oh my God, Sarah, that's terrible. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Sarah replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "But I need to understand what's really going on. This can't be the first time this has happened, and it's certainly not how I trained the staff." "What are you thinking?" Rachel asked. "I want to go undercover," Sarah replied, her tone decisive. "I want to see the hotel from a guest's perspective. Unfiltered, unbiased. I need to know if this behavior is widespread or just limited to a few individuals." Rachel didn't hesitate. "Understood. Let's make it happen. I can book a room under an alias, and we'll keep it discreet. You'll be just another guest on the books." "Thank you, Rachel," Sarah said, grateful for her assistant's support. "This means a lot to me. Let's get it set up for tomorrow evening. I'll go in as an ordinary guest, and we'll see how they treat me." After finalizing the details, Sarah hung up, feeling a sense of relief. She had a plan, a way to confront the issue directly, without tipping off the staff to her true identity. She would observe, take notes, and document her experience from check-in to check-out. Only then would she decide on the next course of action. As she walked back toward her apartment, Sarah's mind raced with anticipation and doubt. She couldn't help but wonder how deep the problem went. The thought that her staff, the people she had hired and trusted, could harbor such prejudices unsettled her deeply. The following day passed slowly, and by early evening, Sarah was prepared to re-enter her hotel, not as the owner but as a regular guest. Dressed in casual attire, she wore a pair of glasses and a slightly messy hairstyle to make her appearance less recognizable. When she entered the lobby that evening, she felt a strange sense of detachment, almost like a stranger observing the place she knew so well. Everything seemed the same. The dazzling chandeliers, the luxurious furniture, the meticulously arranged flower displays. But beneath the surface, Sarah knew something was wrong. She was here to uncover exactly what that was. As she approached the front desk, a different employee greeted her. A young woman with a bright smile that gave Sarah a faint glimmer of hope. "Good evening. Welcome to the Crystal Palm Hotel," the receptionist said warmly. "Do you have a reservation?" Sarah nodded, feeling a surge of relief as the young woman pulled up her booking. "Yes, it should be under Stephanie Jones." "Ah, yes, Ms. Jones," the receptionist replied, her smile unwavering as she tapped on the keyboard. "You're all set for a 2-night stay in one of our executive suites. Is there anything special I can help you with for your stay?" Sarah declined politely, observing the receptionist's genuine friendliness. The check-in process went smoothly, and she felt a brief surge of hope. Maybe her experience the night before had been an anomaly, a case of a few misguided staff members. She made her way to her room, taking in the luxurious decor and elegant furnishings as she walked through the hallways. The room itself was perfect, with a sprawling view of the city skyline, plush bedding, and amenities that spoke to the high standards Sarah had set for the Crystal Palm. She allowed herself a moment of pride. This was the hotel she had envisioned, the place she had worked so hard to create. But despite the smooth check-in, a nagging feeling lingered. She knew she couldn't let herself be lulled into complacency. Her experience thus far had been positive, but she had only scratched the surface. Later that evening, Sarah decided to test the waters by ordering room service. She wanted to see if the level of service extended beyond the front desk. Picking up the phone, she dialed the number for room service and ordered a simple meal, a grilled chicken sandwich with a side of fries. The voice on the other end confirmed her order with a polite "Thank you, Ms. Jones. Your meal will arrive in about 30 minutes." Exactly 30 minutes later, there was a knock on her door. Sarah opened it to find a middle-aged man in a room service uniform, a cart with her meal in front of him. He smiled politely, but as Sarah reached for the tray, she noticed a brief flicker of something in his eyes, an emotion she couldn't quite place. Felt like a momentary lapse, a judgmental hesitation. "Here's your order, ma'am," he said, his voice tightening slightly. "Thank you," Sarah replied, handing him a tip. He took the money but lingered by the door for a moment longer than necessary. Sarah watched him closely, feeling the stirrings of suspicion once again. Was she imagining it, or was there a subtle tension in the way he looked at her? As he left, closing the door behind him, she couldn't shake the feeling that his politeness was a thin veneer, masking something else beneath the surface. Sarah sat down with her meal, her mind buzzing with questions. Her check-in experience had been smooth, but now she was sensing hints of the same dismissiveness she'd encountered the previous night. Was she being paranoid, or was there really a double standard at play? Before she could finish her meal, another knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find two uniformed security guards standing outside, their expressions grim and unwelcoming. "Ms. Jones?" one of them asked. Sarah's heart raced. "Yes, that's me. Is there a problem?" The guard cleared his throat, his tone stiff. "We've received a complaint about your presence in the hotel. We need you to come with us." Sarah felt a surge of disbelief. "A complaint? I haven't done anything wrong. Why are you asking me to leave?" "It's just a routine matter, ma'am," the guard replied, avoiding her gaze. "Please cooperate." A mix of anger and confusion welled up within her. She could see from their faces that they had no interest in listening to her side of the story. The same prejudiced assumptions from the night before had resurfaced, this time under the guise of routine procedure. As she stood there, facing the guards, Sarah felt a profound realization settle over her. This wasn't just about a few misguided staff members. There was a deeper issue within the Crystal Palm, a systemic problem that went against everything she had worked to build. But instead of revealing her identity and asserting her authority, Sarah decided to comply. If she wanted to truly understand the scale of the problem, she needed to let this unfold without interference. She would follow along, bide her time, and uncover the truth one step at a time. Sarah sat alone in her hotel suite, the events of the past 2 days replaying in her mind. She felt like a stranger within her own establishment. Her experience had begun with a dismissive receptionist, escalated to a denial of service in the restaurant, and ended with security insisting she leave the premises based on a vague complaint. The realization hit her hard. There was a culture festering in her hotel that went against everything she stood for. Now, she knew she couldn't address this problem on the surface. She needed to root out its cause and determine how far it reached. It was going to be a difficult, painstaking process, but she was determined. Her hotel had become tainted, and she had no intention of letting that continue. Her first step was to reach out to Rachel again. She trusted her assistant completely and knew that Rachel would stand by her throughout this investigation. Without Rachel's insight and support, getting to the bottom of this would be almost impossible. The following morning, Sarah returned to her office suite, away from the main hotel building. She called Rachel to join her for a private meeting, and within minutes, her assistant was seated across from her, a notebook in hand and an expression of fierce determination on her face. "Rachel, we have a serious problem on our hands," Sarah began, recounting the experiences she'd had as a guest. As she spoke, she noticed the anger and concern growing on Rachel's face. "I can't believe this, Sarah," Rachel said, her voice steady but simmering with anger. "All of this discrimination, this exclusionary attitude, this isn't the hotel you built." "It's not," Sarah agreed, her tone firm, "and I'm not going to let it continue. But I can't walk in and start firing people without proof. This is going to require a delicate approach. We'll need to document, observe, and interview. We need to figure out who's fostering this culture." Rachel nodded, jotting down notes as she absorbed Sarah's words. "I think the first step is to gather as much first-hand information as we can," she suggested. "We should quietly reach out to a few employees, particularly those who interact with guests regularly. If anyone has witnessed this behavior or been told to treat guests differently, we need their stories." Sarah's mind raced, a plan beginning to take shape. "Right?" she replied, thinking out loud. "We'll approach employees we can trust. I know it's risky, but if we can get them to speak candidly, it might reveal just how deep this problem runs." Rachel's expression turned serious. "We'll also need to be discreet about this. If the wrong people find out about your investigation, they might try to cover their tracks or worse, intimidate others into silence." "Agreed," Sarah replied, a fierce determination glinting in her eyes. "This place has become toxic, and I need to understand why." We're not just going to fix the symptoms, Rachel, we're going to eradicate the cause. Together, they made a list of employees Sarah trusted, particularly those who had been with the hotel since its opening. Rachel agreed to contact them carefully, under the guise of routine check-ins, to avoid suspicion. The goal was to determine if these employees had noticed any changes in the way guests were treated, or if they had heard anything concerning from management. As Rachel made her way out to begin this delicate outreach, Sarah sat back in her office chair, contemplating her next move. A thought lingered in her mind: the hotel's general manager, Robert. He was someone she had trusted deeply, a man known for his professionalism and attention to detail. If there was anyone who should have noticed these issues, it was Robert. The thought of confronting him was uncomfortable, but Sarah knew it was necessary. She needed to know if he was involved in perpetuating this culture or if he, too, was unaware of what had been happening under his watch. Later that day, Sarah reached out to Robert and asked him to meet her in her office. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, and as the time approached, Sarah felt a strange mixture of apprehension and resolve. When Robert entered her office, he greeted her warmly, his demeanor as polished as ever. "Sarah, it's good to see you. How are you?" Sarah motioned for him to sit, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming, Robert. There's something we need to discuss, and it's rather urgent." Robert's smile faded as he sensed the seriousness in her tone. He sat down, his gaze attentive and respectful. "Of course. What's going on?" Taking a deep breath, Sarah began. "Robert, I've noticed some troubling behavior among the staff recently. It's been brought to my attention that certain guests are being treated differently, that some are being judged or even denied service based on appearance or perceived status." A flicker of unease crossed Robert's face, but he quickly masked it. "I'm sorry to hear that, Sarah. I wasn't aware of any such behavior. Are you certain?" Sarah studied him closely, searching for any sign of defensiveness or guilt. "Yes, Robert, I'm certain. I've experienced it firsthand. I went undercover as a guest this week, and I was denied service multiple times, ultimately being asked to leave by security." Robert's eyes widened in shock. "You went undercover?" He shook his head, looking genuinely taken aback. "Sarah, I had no idea. If I'd known, I would have." "That's the problem, Robert," she interrupted gently but firmly. "You didn't know. As general manager, you should have been aware of these issues. This isn't just one or two incidents. It's a pattern of behavior that has somehow taken root in this hotel. I need to understand how it happened, and I need your help to uncover the source." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze falling to the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, his expression was earnest. "Sarah, I'm deeply sorry. I had no idea this was happening under my watch. I've always strived to maintain the standards you set, and it hurts me to think that I might have missed something so critical." Sarah softened slightly, sensing his sincerity. "I believe you, Robert, but I need you to be honest with me. Has anyone in upper management, perhaps someone in the executive team, ever suggested that certain guests don't belong here? Have you heard anything at all, that might indicate a bias or prejudice in how we treat our guests?" Robert hesitated, a slight crease forming on his brow. I can't say I've heard anything like that explicitly, but now that you mention it, there have been subtle hints. A few times, Mr. Adams, our head of guest relations, has made comments about maintaining a specific image for the hotel. I never questioned it at the time, but in light of what you've told me, it does seem troubling. Sarah's instincts sharpened. Mr. Adams. She'd never had a reason to doubt him before. He was professional, well-regarded, and known for his attention to guest satisfaction. But perhaps his standards were less about guest satisfaction and more about selective exclusion. "Thank you, Robert," Sarah said, her voice thoughtful. "I'd like you to keep an eye on Mr. Adams and the guest relations department. Discreetly, of course. If you notice anything that seems amiss, please let me know immediately." Robert nodded, visibly relieved to have a directive. "Absolutely, Sarah. I'll do everything I can to help." After he left, Sarah sat in her office, her mind racing with the implications. If Mr. Adams was indeed fostering a discriminatory culture, he might not be working alone. She knew she couldn't confront him directly, not yet. She needed more evidence and a clearer picture of his influence on the staff. As evening fell, Sarah prepared to meet with Rachel and review the initial findings from the employees they'd contacted. Her plan was taking shape, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. She would have to navigate the hidden currents of prejudice within her hotel, and uncovering the truth would require courage, patience, and resolve. For Sarah, this was no longer just an investigation. It was a battle for the heart and soul of the Crystal Palm Hotel. She would not rest until she had restored it to the inclusive and welcoming place she had envisioned. The next day, Sarah met with Rachel in her office. Rachel had a determined expression, holding a folder filled with notes from discreet conversations she'd had with various employees. The air was thick with anticipation as they sat across from each other, ready to analyze the first wave of information. "Okay, Rachel," Sarah began, trying to keep her voice steady. "What have you found so far?" Rachel opened the folder, flipping through pages of notes. "I spoke to about 5 employees in guest relations and food service. Most of them didn't want to say much. They seemed nervous, afraid of backlash. But a couple of them hinted that they'd noticed guests being treated differently, especially when they didn't look or act like what Mr. Adams considers high-end." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "So, Mr. Adams is pushing his own agenda." Rachel nodded. "It seems that way. A few employees mentioned that he's very particular about the hotel's image. He instructs staff to focus on certain types of guests and sometimes subtly discourages others. It's never outright discrimination, but there's a clear preference." As Sarah listened, a mix of anger and sadness welled up inside her. Her hotel, the place she'd built with the vision of inclusion, was being corrupted by prejudice and judgment. One of the housekeepers, Maria, had more to say. Rachel continued, "She's been here since the beginning, and she respects you deeply, Sarah. She admitted that she's seen guests treated poorly if they don't fit in, but she didn't feel she had the authority to speak up." Sarah leaned forward, absorbing every word. "Did Maria mention if Mr. Adams directly instructed her or any others to treat certain guests differently?" Rachel hesitated. She said it was mostly implied. "He never gives outright orders, but he makes his preferences clear through comments or by rewarding employees who seem to get it. It's insidious, Sarah. He's careful to avoid saying anything explicit that could be used against him, but everyone knows what he expects." The pieces were falling into place. Mr. Adams had fostered a culture of exclusion without ever saying the words directly. Sarah knew this wasn't just an issue of bad management. It was a system of subtle, harmful biases infecting the entire organization. And, unfortunately, it was a system he'd crafted to make it difficult to trace back to him. "This isn't going to be easy to dismantle," Sarah admitted, her voice heavy with determination. "But we need to keep gathering information. The fact that some employees are willing to speak, even reluctantly, means we're not alone in this." Rachel nodded. "Agreed. Maria and a few others have already hinted that they'd support any efforts to change things. But I should warn you, people are afraid of Mr. Adams. They see him as untouchable, and they fear retaliation." Sarah's mind worked through the possibilities. If Mr. Adams has established this culture, then he's likely protecting himself by making it clear that he has allies higher up. He wouldn't take these kinds of risks otherwise. A sense of unease settled over them. Mr. Adams was clearly a powerful figure within the hotel's management structure, and if he had support from someone in upper management or on the board, confronting him could be much more complicated and dangerous. "So, what's the plan?" Rachel asked, breaking the silence. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. "We need to get more definitive proof, and we need people who are brave enough to stand up and support a change. We'll continue talking to staff members who seem trustworthy, but we'll also need to confront Mr. Adams at some point." "Do you think it's safe to confront him directly?" Rachel asked, concern evident in her voice. "Not yet," Sarah replied, shaking her head. "We need to gather more evidence first. I want to know exactly who's backing him, if anyone. Once we have that, we can approach this strategically and make sure there's no escape." Rachel nodded, a look of admiration and respect crossing her face. "I'm with you all the way, Sarah. I'll keep reaching out to employees, and I'll let you know if anything significant comes up." As Rachel left the office to continue her quiet investigation, Sarah felt the weight of the task ahead pressing down on her. She knew this wouldn't be a quick or simple resolution. But as much as she dreaded the conflict, she felt more certain than ever that she had to fight for the integrity of her hotel. Her vision had always been one of inclusivity and respect, and she couldn't stand by and let it be tarnished by prejudice and exclusion. She decided to spend the rest of the day observing the hotel's operations firsthand. Dressed in business attire but without drawing attention to her identity, Sarah moved through various areas of the hotel, watching and listening carefully. Her heart ached as she witnessed small moments of biased treatment. Guests ignored, subtle glances exchanged among staff when certain guests approached. That evening, as she was making her way back to her suite, she noticed Maria, the housekeeper Rachel had mentioned. Maria was standing near the elevator, her expression tired but determined. She looked up, spotting Sarah, and hesitated before giving a polite nod. Sarah seized the moment, walking over to her. "Maria, can I speak with you for a moment?" Maria looked around nervously, then nodded. "Yes, of course, Ms. Hamilton." They moved to a quiet corner, away from the main traffic of guests and employees. Sarah offered Maria a reassuring smile. "I wanted to thank you for being open with Rachel. I know it's not easy to speak up." Maria shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at her hands. "Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. I've been wanting to say something for a long time, but Mr. Adams has a way of making people afraid. He has connections. He makes people feel like if they don't do things his way, they'll be replaced." Sarah's heart sank at Maria's words. "I understand, Maria, and you don't need to be afraid. I'm committed to fixing this, but I need your help. If there's anything specific you've seen or heard, it could make a huge difference." Maria took a deep breath, as though gathering her courage. "I overheard Mr. Adams talking to one of the supervisors last month. He said something like, 'We don't need to waste time on people who don't fit our image.' He didn't say anything more specific, but it was clear what he meant." Sarah felt a flash of anger, but she kept her tone calm and steady. "Thank you, Maria. That's helpful to know. Is there anything else?" Maria hesitated again, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "I've also noticed that some of the guest requests, like for room upgrades or special services, get ignored if Mr. Adams doesn't approve of the guest's look. He only wants certain people in the high-end suites." Sarah nodded, her mind working quickly to piece together the extent of the problem. "Maria, I promise you that we're going to fix this. You're not alone in this, and we're going to make the Crystal Palm a place where everyone feels valued." Maria managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. I believe you." As Sarah walked away from her conversation with Maria, her determination solidified even further. She was beginning to see the full picture, and with each piece of evidence she gathered, her resolve grew stronger. She headed back to her suite to regroup, knowing that the next phase of her plan would require courage and caution. She would have to confront Mr. Adams soon, but before doing so, she needed to understand exactly who was protecting him. Only then could she dismantle the network that allowed this culture to thrive. In the quiet of her suite, Sarah planned her next steps. The Crystal Palm's reputation and her own integrity as its owner were on the line, and no matter what it took, she would see this battle through to the end. The days that followed were a whirlwind of observation, note-taking, and careful conversations. Sarah had begun to see just how deeply ingrained the discriminatory practices were within her hotel's culture. It was exhausting work, emotionally draining and sometimes even disheartening. Yet each new piece of evidence fueled her resolve to dismantle the toxic environment that had taken root. Finally, Sarah felt she was ready to confront Mr. Adams. She had amassed statements from several employees who'd been quietly instructed to treat certain guests as lesser. Maria's testimony, in particular, had given her a critical insight into Mr. Adams' veiled language. She also had documented patterns in the financial reports that Rachel had gathered, small but repeated losses in revenue tied to guests who had checked out early due to poor treatment. All of it pointed to a culture of subtle but damaging prejudice. Before she made her move, Sarah decided to confide in Robert, her hotel's general manager, once again. She needed to know if he would stand with her or if his loyalty to Mr. Adams would cloud his judgment. In her office, Robert sat across from her, looking uneasy. He seemed to sense the weight of the conversation they were about to have. "Robert," Sarah began, her voice steady but serious, "I need you to be completely honest with me. I'm aware that Mr. Adams has been fostering a discriminatory environment within the Crystal Palm. I also have reason to believe he's been acting with the support of someone on the executive team." Robert's face grew pale. He shifted uncomfortably, and for a moment, Sarah wondered if he would remain silent. But after a long pause, he finally spoke. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've suspected that something was off for a while now. I didn't know it was as severe as you're describing, but I've heard things. Mr. Adams has always been very particular about our image, and I've heard him make comments about maintaining standards." Sarah felt a flicker of frustration but kept her expression calm. "Robert, as general manager, you were in a position to stop this. Why didn't you?" Robert's gaze dropped, shame visible in his eyes. "I tried to justify it to myself, thinking that maybe I was misinterpreting his words, but deep down I knew. I was just afraid. Mr. Adams isn't acting alone, Sarah. He's backed by someone with a lot of influence. If I had acted against him without proof, I could have lost everything." "Who is protecting him?" Sarah pressed, her voice filled with urgency. Robert hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "There are rumors, whispers among the staff, that Mr. Adams is connected to Mr. Thorne." Sarah's blood ran cold at the name. Mr. Thorne was a senior member of the hotel's board of directors, a man with substantial influence and connections. He had always presented himself as a staunch supporter of the Crystal Palm, advising Sarah on business strategies and funding new developments. The idea that he could be involved in this discrimination felt like a betrayal of the highest order. "Mr. Thorne," Sarah repeated, her tone sharp. Robert nodded, looking visibly distressed. "Yes, he and Mr. Adams are close, and Mr. Thorne has a certain view on luxury hospitality. He believes that exclusivity is the key to the hotel's reputation, and he's willing to sacrifice certain values to maintain that image." The revelation was both shocking and illuminating. It explained how Mr. Adams had managed to avoid accountability for so long. With Mr. Thorne's protection, he had been free to implement his exclusionary policies, creating a selective environment that ran counter to Sarah's vision. "Thank you, Robert," Sarah said quietly. "I know this wasn't easy to admit, but I appreciate your honesty. I'm going to confront Mr. Adams and put an end to this. I need you to stand by me when I do." Robert nodded solemnly. "You have my full support, Sarah." As Robert left her office, Sarah took a moment to process the gravity of the situation. She was about to go head-to-head with two powerful figures within her own business. If she wasn't careful, they could try to silence her or, worse, undermine her authority entirely. The next morning, Sarah called Mr. Adams into her office. He entered with his usual air of confidence, clearly unaware of what was about to unfold. He smiled politely as he took a seat across from her desk. "Good morning, Ms. Hamilton. How can I assist you today?" he asked, his tone smooth and professional. Sarah didn't return his smile. Instead, she leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Adams, I'm aware of the discriminatory practices you've been enforcing within this hotel." Mr. Adams blinked, his smile fading as a guarded expression crossed his face. "I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to, Ms. Hamilton." "I think you understand perfectly," Sarah replied, her voice cold and steady. "I've gathered statements from employees who've witnessed your instructions to treat certain guests as less important based on their appearance or perceived status. You've created an exclusionary culture here, and I'm putting an end to it." For a brief moment, a flicker of fear appeared in Mr. Adams' eyes, but it quickly faded, replaced by a look of defiance. He sat up straighter, his expression hardening. "I think you're misunderstanding my intentions, Ms. Hamilton," he said, his tone laced with irritation. "I've only ever worked to uphold the standards of luxury that you yourself established. We cater to a specific clientele here, and I'm simply ensuring that we maintain an atmosphere of exclusivity." "Exclusivity," Sarah repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "No, you've been enforcing discrimination, plain and simple, and I will not tolerate it." Mr. Adams met her gaze with a smirk. "You may not have much of a choice. I'm not the only one who believes in these standards. The board, and particularly Mr. Thorne, share my vision for the Crystal Palm. You may own this hotel, Ms. Hamilton, but you're not above the board." Sarah felt a surge of anger but forced herself to stay composed. "Mr. Thorne may have influence, but he does not have the right to undermine the core values of this establishment. And he certainly doesn't have the right to condone discriminatory practices. This hotel was built on the principle of inclusivity, and I will not let you or anyone else destroy that." Mr. Adams' smirk faltered, and for the first time, he looked genuinely unsettled. "I'd be careful if I were you, Ms. Hamilton. You're playing a dangerous game." "That's where you're wrong," Sarah replied, her voice calm but steely. "The only game here is one of integrity, and I assure you, I'm prepared to see it through." There was a tense silence as Mr. Adams weighed his options. Finally, he rose from his seat, his gaze cold and calculating. "Very well, Ms. Hamilton. If you insist on pursuing this path, you can expect resistance." "Consider this your warning, Mr. Adams," Sarah said, her voice firm. "Any further attempts to undermine the values of this hotel will result in your immediate dismissal. This is your last chance." Mr. Adams glared at her, a silent threat in his eyes, before turning and leaving the office without another word. Sarah's heart raced as she watched him go. She knew she had made a powerful enemy, and with Mr. Thorne backing him, this battle was far from over. But she also knew that she couldn't back down, not when the very soul of her hotel was at stake. That evening, as Sarah reflected on the confrontation, she received an unexpected message from Robert. The message was brief but urgent. "Meet me in the office tonight. I found something important." Sarah's mind filled with questions as she headed to the office. Robert had seemed nervous during their last conversation, but she hadn't expected him to find new information so quickly. She arrived to find him waiting, a stack of documents spread across the desk. "Sarah," Robert began, his voice tense, "I've been looking through some of the financial records, specifically, payments that didn't quite add up." He handed her a few documents, and as she scanned them, she felt her heart sink. There were discrepancies in the records, small payments that had been routed to an unlisted account. The transactions were too consistent to be a mistake, yet subtle enough to avoid detection at first glance. "It's Mr. Adams," Robert confirmed. "He's been siphoning money, diverting it from certain transactions. I suspect it's tied to guests who've left early or been turned away due to his exclusionary practices." Sarah felt a mix of fury and determination. Mr. Adams wasn't just fostering discrimination, he was actively profiting from it. And with Mr. Thorne's protection, he had felt untouchable. "Thank you, Robert," Sarah said, her voice tight. "This is exactly what I needed. We're going to take him down and expose anyone who's been protecting him." Robert nodded, his expression resolute. "I'm with you, Sarah. Whatever you need." As she left the office, a plan was already forming in Sarah's mind. She would gather every piece of evidence, confront Mr. Thorne, and bring this toxic culture to light. The Crystal Palm would become the inclusive haven she had always dreamed of, and neither Mr. Adams nor Mr. Thorne would stand in her way. But deep down, she knew this battle had only just begun. In the days that followed, Sarah felt an unsettling tension settle over the Crystal Palm Hotel. She knew that her confrontation with Mr. Adams had shaken him, but she also knew he wasn't going to give up easily. With Mr. Thorne's influence shielding him, he would likely try to undermine her position, perhaps even paint her as a disruptive force threatening the hotel's prestige. But Sarah wasn't alone. Robert's discovery of the financial discrepancies had given her the concrete evidence she needed to press forward. Armed with proof of Mr. Adams' unethical practices, Sarah prepared herself for a larger confrontation with both Adams and Thorne. One evening, Sarah received a text message from Robert that sent a chill down her spine. "We need to talk now. Meet me in the lobby." Sarah didn't waste a moment. She made her way down to the lobby, wondering what new information Robert had uncovered. The air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers, but tonight, the elegant decor and soft lighting felt like a thin veil covering something much darker. She found Robert standing near the grand staircase, his face drawn with anxiety. As she approached, he gestured for her to follow him into a quiet corner of the lobby, away from the guests and staff. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you need to know about Mr. Thorne." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Go on." Robert swallowed, glancing around as though afraid someone might overhear them. "Mr. Thorne has been using the hotel's resources for his own gain. I didn't see it clearly before, but now I understand. He's been quietly profiting from select high-paying clients, securing preferential treatment for them, and he's been doing it under the radar for years." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Preferential treatment? For what purpose?" "It's not just about money," Robert continued, his voice shaking slightly. "He's been crafting an image, creating a private club atmosphere within the hotel, where only certain types of guests are truly welcomed. Mr. Adams is just his puppet, ensuring that guests who don't meet their standards are subtly pushed out." Sarah felt a surge of anger. So Thorne has been orchestrating this elitist atmosphere all along. He's been encouraging Adams to discriminate, to treat people like they don't belong. Robert nodded grimly. "And it's not just a preference, it's a policy. Thorne believes that exclusivity will elevate the hotel's brand. He's convinced the other board members that this approach is the key to Crystal Palm's success. He thinks you're the one who doesn't understand the true nature of luxury." Sarah clenched her fists. This was worse than she'd imagined. Thorne wasn't just complicit in Adams' behavior. He was the architect of a toxic culture that went against everything she'd envisioned for the hotel. "Thank you for telling me this, Robert," she said quietly, feeling the weight of his revelation. "But now we need to gather enough evidence to confront him, and to show the board exactly what he's been doing." Robert nodded, but a flicker of fear crossed his face. "Sarah, we need to be careful. Thorne is powerful. He has connections, and if he finds out we're investigating him, he won't hesitate to protect himself." "I understand the risks, Robert," Sarah replied, her voice firm, "but I refuse to let this continue. I'll confront Thorne myself if I have to." As they parted ways, Sarah's mind raced with strategies. She knew that confronting Thorne directly could be dangerous, but if she didn't act soon, he would continue to corrode the values she had built Crystal Palm upon. She would need a foolproof plan, and possibly an unexpected ally. Later that evening, Sarah confided in Rachel, sharing everything Robert had told her. Rachel listened intently, her expression growing darker with every word. "So Thorne's been profiting off a select group of guests while pushing everyone else aside," Rachel said, disgust evident in her tone. "That's vile, and it's the complete opposite of the values you've instilled here." "Exactly," Sarah replied, "but he's been careful to keep his actions hidden, and he's created a network of supporters among the board who buy into his vision for the hotel. I need a way to expose him, to show everyone what he's really been doing." Rachel's face lit up with a sudden idea. "What if we use his own arrogance against him?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," Rachel said. "Thorne believes he's untouchable because of his influence and connections. He'll be confident, maybe even careless if he thinks he's in control. If we arrange a situation where he feels secure, he might let his guard down and reveal more than he intends. Sarah's mind worked quickly. You're right, but how do we get him to expose himself? Rachel leaned in, her voice low. If we could somehow gather him, Adams, and a few of his favored guests in a private setting, he might let slip his real intentions. All we need to do is get that conversation recorded. Once we have it, we could present it to the board. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. It was risky, but it could work. We'll need to organize a small, exclusive gathering under the pretense of strengthening client relations. And we'll invite Thorne and Adams, along with a few of the guests he's been favoring. Rachel nodded. We'll keep it discreet. Only invite those who are loyal to Thorne's vision. I can arrange the recording equipment and handle logistics. The plan was set. Over the next few days, Rachel worked tirelessly to arrange a small gathering for a select few of Crystal Palm's most exclusive clients. Thorne and Adams readily agreed, eager to discuss how they could continue elevating the hotel's elite atmosphere. The night of the gathering, Sarah and Rachel carefully positioned recording devices in the private dining room where the event was held. Sarah was both nervous and determined, knowing that this was her chance to catch Thorne and Adams in the act. As she observed the event from a nearby room, Sarah watched through a one-way glass as Thorne welcomed the guests, making small talk with an air of entitlement. Adams hovered nearby, eager to please his boss. Thorne raised his glass to begin a toast. To Crystal Palm, a sanctuary for the discerning few. We're not just another hotel. We're a curated experience for those who appreciate true luxury. The guests raised their glasses, murmuring in agreement. Thorne continued, his voice dripping with confidence. You see, luxury is all about exclusivity. Not everyone deserves this kind of experience, and that's why we're so selective about who we allow in. Only those who fit a certain image belong here. Sarah felt a wave of anger at his words, but she kept her focus, knowing the recording was capturing every word. One of the guests, a wealthy businessman who was a close associate of Thorne, chimed in, "And that's why I love this place. You don't let just anyone in. I know my family, and I won't have to deal with people who don't fit our lifestyle here." Thorne smiled, clearly pleased. Precisely. And with Adams managing the guest relations, we've ensured that every guest who doesn't meet our standards is directed elsewhere. The room filled with knowing laughter, and Sarah felt her anger flare. It was one thing to have suspicions about Thorne and Adams, but hearing them speak so openly about their discriminatory practices was almost too much to bear. Thorne leaned back, his voice lowering but still audible. And I'm telling you this now because soon, we'll be making further changes to ensure that only the most exclusive clientele have access to the best parts of the hotel. We'll be restructuring under new management guidelines that will discourage certain types of guests from even setting foot here. Sarah clenched her fists. Thorne and Adams were planning to push their exclusionary agenda even further, likely under the guise of restructuring. The recording continued, capturing each word as Thorne and Adams discussed their plans to marginalize guests who didn't fit their ideal of wealth and refinement. It was a damning conversation, one that would leave no doubt about their intentions. After the gathering ended and the guests had left, Sarah and Rachel retrieved the recording devices and reviewed the footage. Every discriminatory remark, every veiled insult, and every cruel laugh had been captured. Rachel looked up from the recording, her face pale but determined. "We've got them, Sarah. This is irrefutable evidence." Sarah nodded, a fierce resolve in her eyes. "Tomorrow we take this to the board. I want Thorne and Adams removed, and I want everyone to know the true vision of this hotel." The next morning, armed with the recording and her stack of employee testimonies, Sarah entered the boardroom, ready to confront the very forces that had tried to undermine everything she'd worked for. Her heart pounded, but she knew that this battle was hers to win. The following morning, Sarah walked into the boardroom with Rachel by her side. Her heart pounded with both nerves and resolve. She had all the evidence she needed, but she knew this wouldn't be an easy confrontation. Mr. Thorne and Mr. Adams had wielded power within the Crystal Palm Hotel for years, and they had allies on the board who likely shared their views. But Sarah was prepared to do whatever it took to restore the integrity of her hotel. As the board members gathered, Mr. Thorne entered with his usual air of confidence, exchanging polite greetings with others around the table. Mr. Adams was already seated, looking calm and composed, clearly unaware of the storm that was about to hit. When everyone was settled, Sarah stood up and addressed the room. "Thank you all for joining me today. There's a critical matter we need to discuss regarding the operations and values of the Crystal Palm." Mr. Thorne leaned back in his chair, looking mildly amused. "Always committed to high standards, aren't we, Sarah?" he said with a smirk. Sarah ignored his comment and continued, her voice steady. "Over the past few weeks, I've conducted an investigation into discriminatory practices within the hotel, practices that undermine our core mission of inclusivity and respect." She glanced around the room, watching as a few board members shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Adams, however, remained impassive, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I have evidence," Sarah said, her gaze meeting Thorne's, "that certain members of our management team have not only encouraged but systematically enforced exclusionary policies, ensuring that only a select type of guest feels welcome at the Crystal Palm." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room, and Mr. Thorne's smirk faded, replaced by a wary expression. "Sarah, I'm sure we can discuss any alleged misunderstandings in a more appropriate setting," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "No, Mr. Thorne," Sarah replied firmly. "This is the appropriate setting. And these are not misunderstandings. They are violations of our standards and values, and they are serious." She nodded to Rachel, who set up a laptop connected to a projector. "What you're about to hear is a recording from a private event organized by Mr. Thorne and Mr. Adams. It captures their views on exclusivity and their intentions for restructuring the hotel's policies." The recording began to play, filling the boardroom with the voices of Thorne and Adams as they spoke openly about selective standards, exclusive clientele, and their plans to discourage certain types of guests. Each remark was damning, a clear indication of their discriminatory attitudes and disregard for the hotel's mission. As the recording continued, the color drained from Thorne's face. Several board members looked shocked, while others wore expressions of disgust. Mr. Adams clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists as he realized the gravity of the situation. When the recording finished, silence filled the room. Sarah took a deep breath, then spoke. "This is not only a violation of everything the Crystal Palm stands for, but it's also a gross abuse of our resources and reputation. Mr. Thorne and Mr. Adams have been using their positions to enforce a culture of discrimination, exclusion, and elitism. They have tarnished our reputation and created an environment that goes against every principle we stand for." One of the board members, a woman named Linda, spoke up, her voice filled with anger. "I can't believe this. We trusted you, Mr. Thorne, to uphold our values, not betray them. This behavior is unacceptable." Several other board members nodded in agreement, clearly shocked and appalled by the revelations. Mr. Thorne, however, was quick to recover his composure. "I think we're overreacting here," Thorne said, attempting to dismiss the accusations. "These were simply comments about maintaining a certain standard of service. There was no harm intended. This is luxury hospitality. Exclusivity is a core principle of our business." Sarah shook her head. "Exclusivity doesn't have to mean discrimination, Mr. Thorne. You've twisted the meaning of luxury to fit your own outdated prejudices, and I won't allow it to continue." Another board member spoke up, addressing Sarah. "Do you have any additional evidence, Ms. Hamilton?" "Yes, I do," Sarah replied, handing out copies of the employee statements. "These are testimonies from several employees who have witnessed or been subjected to Mr. Adams' discriminatory practices. You'll also see records of financial discrepancies, funds that were funneled into accounts under the direction of Mr. Adams, likely to secure private benefits for Thorne's favored guests." The board members skimmed through the documents, their expressions growing darker as they read. Sarah saw the mounting anger and disgust on their faces, and she knew that the tide was turning in her favor. Finally, Linda looked up, addressing Mr. Thorne and Mr. Adams with a stern gaze. This behavior is not only unethical but also illegal. You've not only betrayed the trust of this board but also jeopardized the reputation of the Crystal Palm. Mr. Thorne's face hardened. "You're making a mistake," he said through gritted teeth, his calm facade cracking. "This hotel was built on exclusivity, and if you tear that down, you'll ruin everything we've worked for." Sarah met his gaze, unwavering. "What you've worked for, Mr. Thorne, is a culture of elitism that doesn't belong here. The Crystal Palm will be a place of luxury and respect for all guests, not just those you deem worthy." Mr. Thorne stood up abruptly, his face red with anger. "You may have won this round, Sarah, but I can assure you, this isn't over. You don't understand the forces you're dealing with." "That may be true," Sarah replied, her voice calm but resolute. "But I do understand that the Crystal Palm deserves better than what you've tried to make it. And I won't allow you or anyone else to tear down the values this hotel was built upon." After a tense pause, one of the senior board members cleared his throat, signaling the end of the discussion. "Thank you, Ms. Hamilton, for bringing this to our attention. We'll be discussing disciplinary actions against Mr. Thorne and Mr. Adams, effective immediately." With that, the meeting was adjourned. Mr. Thorne and Mr. Adams left the room in silence, their expressions a mixture of anger and defeat. Sarah watched them go, feeling a profound sense of relief. She had won the battle, but she knew this was only the beginning of a long journey to restore her hotel's integrity. As the other board members left, Linda approached Sarah. "I want you to know that the board fully supports your vision. Thank you for standing up for what's right. It's rare to find someone willing to put values above profit." "Thank you, Linda," Sarah replied, feeling a surge of gratitude. "I believe that true luxury is rooted in respect and inclusivity, and I'm committed to building that here." Linda smiled warmly. "You're a rare leader, Sarah. We're lucky to have you." With Thorne and Adams removed from their positions, Sarah knew the real work was only beginning. The toxic culture they'd fostered wasn't going to disappear overnight. Over the next few days, Sarah and Rachel set about planning a complete restructuring of the Crystal Palm's policies and management approach. They both knew it was time to rebuild the hotel from the inside out. The first step was a meeting with the remaining staff to communicate the new vision. As employees gathered in the main ballroom, a nervous energy filled the air. Some had feared for their jobs under Adam's reign. Others had grown accustomed to the old ways. But today, Sarah intended to set a new tone. She stepped up to the podium, her gaze steady as she looked out at her employees, many of whom had been with the hotel since it opened. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice filled with warmth and determination. "I know the past few weeks have been tense and uncertain. Changes have been made, and I want to be transparent with each of you about what these changes mean and what the future holds for the Crystal Palm." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. "When I started this hotel, I envisioned it as a place of luxury and elegance. Yes, but also as a place where every guest, no matter their background, would feel respected and welcomed," she continued. "Unfortunately, certain individuals exploited their positions and compromised these values, leading us away from our mission. Today, we're setting things right." Sarah took a deep breath. "We're introducing new training on inclusivity, respect, and customer service. Every employee, regardless of position, will be part of this initiative. I want each of you to feel proud of the work you do, and to understand that every guest who walks through our doors is valued equally." A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd, but Sarah continued with unwavering resolve. "And I know change can be hard. It's natural to feel unsure or even resistant, but I promise you that this change will make us stronger, more united, and more successful. If we all work together, we can create an atmosphere of true luxury, rooted in respect." The room fell silent, and then Maria, the housekeeper who had courageously shared her experiences, stepped forward, her expression one of relief and pride. "Thank you, Ms. Hamilton," she said, her voice filled with emotion. This means so much to all of us who just wanted to do our jobs without fear or judgment. Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of unity begin to take root. Thank you, Maria, and thank all of you for your patience and courage. Change starts with each of us, and together we'll make this hotel a place we can all be proud of. The employees broke into applause, and as Sarah looked out at them, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was her team, her hotel, and together, they would make it stronger than ever. With the support of her employees, Sarah turned her attention to rebuilding trust with the guests. She implemented policies to ensure that every complaint was documented and taken seriously. Special accommodations were made to reach out to previous guests who had experienced poor treatment, inviting them back with assurances of a renewed experience. Rachel worked tirelessly by her side, handling guest communications and designing a new website that emphasized inclusivity and excellence in equal measure. A few loyal clients had already begun to praise the changes, sharing positive reviews and spreading the word about the new Crystal Palm. Maria was promoted to head of guest relations, a role in which she could directly oversee interactions between the staff and guests, ensuring the highest standards of respect and kindness were upheld. Sarah wanted Maria's voice to be heard and respected at the highest levels. On the night of Maria's promotion, Sarah held a small celebration in the hotel's lounge. Employees gathered to congratulate Maria, and Sarah took a moment to thank each of them for their commitment to the new vision. As she raised a glass, a sense of peace and pride settled over her. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We've weathered a storm, but I truly believe the future is bright for all of us. Thank you for standing with me and with each other. Let's make the Crystal Palm a place we can all call home." The cheers and laughter that followed were genuine, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of calm. They were no longer bound by the constraints of a toxic leadership. They were building a legacy of which they could all be proud. Months passed, and the transformation at the Crystal Palm became apparent to everyone who visited. Guests from all backgrounds, ages, and styles felt welcome, and the hotel's reputation as an inclusive luxury destination spread quickly. Staff morale was high, and even the board members acknowledged the profound positive changes under Sarah's leadership. One evening, as Sarah was working late in her office, she received an unexpected message. It was from a former guest, a woman who had once been dismissed at the front desk by Adams. She wrote to express her gratitude, saying she'd returned to the hotel with her family and experienced a warm welcome beyond her expectations. Sarah sat back, smiling as she read the message. This was why she had fought so hard, why she had refused to back down in the face of corruption and prejudice. The Crystal Palm had become what she'd always dreamed it would be, a place where every guest was valued, and where true luxury came from inclusivity and kindness. As Sarah looked out over the city lights from her office window, she knew there would always be challenges ahead, but she felt ready to face them. She had built something lasting, something meaningful, and with the team by her side, she knew they would continue to create a legacy of warmth, elegance, and respect. The Crystal Palm was no longer just a hotel. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of integrity, and the beginning of a brighter future.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.